Imagine being told your entire life what you would never become, only to spend your life proving everyone wrong. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Hodges, president and co founder of Pieces of Me Foundation. Daniel shares his journey living with blindness, chronic pain, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and how turning pain into service helped him create hope for others. Daniel, welcome to the show. I'm very excited for our conversation.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Well, I don't want to waste any more time. I just want to turn the microphone over to you and have you tell us about your journey.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I was born blind. I've got a little bit of vision in one eye and nothing in the other. And I was also born with a connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos, which had some weird complications attached to it, some structural abnormalities in my femurs and hips, all the way up into my pelvis. And I had a lot of joint involvement as well, where my joints are prone to fracture, dislocation, other things like that. So when I talk about chronic pain, it's a lot of times quite severe. I've had surgeries all over my body just to try to keep things in some level of homeostasis. And, it's been a battle of trying to figure out, okay, how do I go and maintain a fulfilling life while also not pushing myself beyond what I can reasonably handle? And while I was growing up, my parents, the school district, none of them had a real solid idea of what to do with a kid who could barely see. So we focused on maximizing eyesight and trying to, give me the largest print possible, which I could use to a very limited degree. But for all intents and purposes, I was, you could say, functionally illiterate. And I ended up actually missing grades 7 through 11 completely because the system just fell through. Um, and knowing these things and many others that we'll probably get into led me into a path of advocacy and trying to make some doors open for other people because I knew what it meant to be counted out. I knew what it meant to have professionals say, "Oh, well, all he'll ever be able to do is cane chairs," and he'll never go to college, he'll never have a family, he'll never blah blah blah. And I knew what it meant to be denied jobs that I was qualified for because somebody couldn't imagine doing something without their sight, without even letting me say, "Hey, there's alternative techniques, there's assistive technology, there's ways to do this." And then also being in a situation where when my ex-wife and I had our first kid, we actually had to fight to keep custody of her while she was dealing with cancer because the hospital and some other professionals couldn't imagine how blind people could successfully parent. We ended up keeping custody. My daughter ended up beating her cancer. All of that ended up, quote unquote, all right, but it still took a toll. And it did eventually lead me to ask, okay, how can I turn these things into a powerful force for good? How can I turn, as you said, my pain into purpose? And ultimately, I was led to law school when a couple of mentors said, "Hey, you're a great advocate. You're smart. You're articulate. What would it take to get you to think about law school?" I thought to myself, I'm broke, and I worry about access, and I worry about chronic pain, and all of these other things. But eventually, I did what I had to do, and said, "Okay, I've got two people who don't know each other who brought this to me, and within 48 hours of each other, and so this can't be a coincidence." Knelt, prayed about it, just put it out there at the end of a terrible anxiety spell. And I started to watch one door after another open. First there was, how am I going to even pay for the LSAT, let alone anything else? And then that funding came through. And then it was, how am I going to get money for applications, or how am I going to get money to go, tour law schools? How am I going to, get past some serious academic gaps in my transcript that were a byproduct of mental health meds? How am I going to explain that away? How am I going to get voc rehab to do what they're supposed to do? And over the course of the next year, I saw one door after another open until I found myself in Baltimore studying law school. And less than a year after that, I found myself in the midst of another really bad mental health episode that we'll probably get deeper into. And that's when the inspiration to start Pieces of Me started, because as it so happened, God found me in a very vulnerable, very raw place and gave me an assignment that, frankly, I might not have been real enthused about had I been feeling more solid in my life. Because, I mean, who starts a nonprofit while they're between their first and second year of law school? Not to mention, all of the other stuff I had going on. But Um, the other the other things, just to get the basic bio out of the way, are, for anyone who cares, I will be referencing faith throughout this because it's part of my journey. If you're curious, I do happen to be an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That doesn't necessarily represent my organization's view because we are inclusive. I work with people from all kinds of faith traditions and no religious beliefs at all. I love that interactive work, but for me, my personal faith is my North Star. So I think that's about everything of the bio. Oh, and I'm joining you from East Texas if you care. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Yeah, awesome. You and I love just hearing about your background here, and it opens me up. There's so many different ways I could go with this, so I'm gonna start with one of my first. I'm just curious with this. Like you said, you missed grades 7 through 11. How did that impact your confidence and identity at that time?
It impacted me significantly, not only um, by virtue of the academic things that I missed out on, which fortunately I was able to make up for, but it you think about how much you learn about studying at that time. You think about how much you learned socially at that time. And by the way, because I was the guy who was wearing glasses that were as thick as my finger before then, I didn't have great social interactions before then. I was somebody who dealt with exclusion and bullying and name calling, etc., etc. So I went from that to almost complete isolation from my peer group for years, and then, you know, trying to figure out, okay, how do I fit in? How do I make it work as somebody who very obviously can't see and doesn't have great social skills, and somebody who had never been around someone who was blind or visually impaired at that point. And finally, for my 12th grade year, I did get to go to the school for the blind, so I got some of those questions answered. But I think the social aspect is the part that really gets overlooked when you talk about that 5-year period.
Yeah, for sure. And I could see that. So, kind of adding in the mental health side of things here, uh, would you say that the mental health struggles that you deal with, have they always been prevalent, or was there something that kind of set them off? Like, the just the like something in life that just like clicked and like, okay, well, now I'm gonna. All of a sudden, you saw anxiety or suicidal ideation kick in.
Yeah, so I had what you could reasonably consider to be some level of anxiety all the way back as far as I can remember. I mean, every kid deals with different things that they're afraid of, but this was um more than just that. And then when my parents separated, I was 7, 8. I was 8 when my parents separated, and um, there was there was definitely some trauma in that, particularly in the way that it happened, that led me to start really struggling. And as it happened, the the separation of my parents and me being uprooted from Ohio to Idaho, and then me experiencing my first real episodes of bullying, all happened within several months of each other. Idaho was not a good place for me in that regard, or really any other. And so that was a struggle for a while, just trying to, again, figure out who am I, and is my identity, is my potential actually tied to my ability to see? And then you go back to that period, grade 7 through 11. Yeah, that's when the depression really started to get worse. That's when the ideas about self harm started to come in, and eventually I was in my mid teens when it went from being I could think about doing this to I was actually actively self harming and figuring out ways to hide it from anyone around me.
And that's an extremely, like, scary place to be too, like, an extremely scary and dark place to be, because I've had things happen in my life where, um, I didn't quite get to the self-harm phase, but I did get to the point where I knew what I was gonna do and how I was gonna do it. But I look back now, it's like, I it's just hard to explain that, like, state of mind of where you're at, because it's like when you're in those depression, dark moments, you don't it's like your mind doesn't understand what's really doing.
In my mind, it was, um, in my mind, it was, how can I, how can I drown out this mental pain that I'm dealing with, and somehow the option of replacing it with, or covering it up with, physical pain somehow became the answer. And it's like it became a real crutch that I got stuck on, and wasn't able to quite break for any length of time for probably close to a decade.
Crazy. Like, it's just the mind, like, really does work in mysterious ways. And
It
it
does.
sometimes Oh, go ahead, you're fine.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, sometimes, like, we have to go through that I feel like with me, I had to go through that darkness, though, in order to get to where I'm at today, and in order to admit that, like, I had a problem and needed proper help.
Absolutely. And you know, I I eventually started to at least find some equilibrium in my late teens. And by that point, my ex-wife and I were dating, and know she had her own mental health struggles. And so at that season of my life, it was okay. We're at once, we're each other's stronger supporters. There was real empathy, but at the same time, one person's um mental collapse could very easily lead to the others. And so I look back on that time and I'm like, man, it's a miracle that it didn't get any worse than it did. But I remember, um the first time that my ex-wife saw me having a full-blown panic attack, and she knew that I had them, but she had never witnessed them in person. And I think she was picturing, maybe a crying spell, maybe a little, um, a little quivering, whatever. And what she ended up witnessing was something that pretty closely resembled a grand mal seizure. It was, that bad. And eventually reached out, tried to find help, went through some different therapy options, and actually ended up on several medications that frankly didn't help. And so I mentioned earlier that my transcript was a mess going into law school. And the reason was I had, you know, made it through the first couple of years of undergrad and then tried to do the psychiatric route. And the medications resulted in no less or no fewer mental health symptoms, but I was sleeping like 18 hours a day. I was completely numb and I was an absolute bear to be around. So, that's it didn't turn out to be the answer I hoped it would be.
Yeah, yeah, and I've heard that. Well, I have some personal experience with like medication, but you're not the only person that has told me that medication did not really help for them. Like it's so I feel like when it comes to like antidepressants and SSRIs and stuff, like it's very hit or miss. Uh, so I'm trying to think. So you mentioned, you can correct me if I heard this wrong. You mentioned you kind of had a mental health crisis during law school. What did that look like behind closed doors?
Yeah, so I had a I had a really bad one during law school, and it wasn't when you would expect it to happen either. I had made it through, all of the first set of finals and all of the pressure and all of the cold calling, all of that. I did okay with that. Um, I had I had mentally prepared myself for that. But it was the external stuff. There was a situation with the kid's mom where she ended up nearly dying due to I'm just gonna call it medical malpractice because it was a situation that involved med mal, and, um, that ended up resulting in her and the kids being suddenly back in Idaho, um, within a few days of all of this happening. So I'm like, "Okay, I've got 6 weeks left this semester," and I went from seeing my kids whenever I wanted to now they're across the country from me like that. And then there was a situation where I had been thinking about, trying to move on, and I had fallen for somebody and had prayed about it, fasted about it, felt really strongly that this situation was going to work out. And the long and the short of it is, she prayed about it, had a different answer, and my inability to our inability to reconcile that ended up in not only, us ending up in different places, but actually ended up dissolving the friendship because we were just in a place where moving forward wasn't tenable. And so, um, it wasn't as much about romantic rejection as it was me saying, okay, I felt like I had a strong spiritual impression here. What happened? Have I lost my ability to follow the inspiration that I feel like I'm getting? And that's where it got really scary because I'm like, if I can't rely on the Holy Ghost um to make it through this haze, if I'm operating truly on my own, I'm so screwed. And that's where I started to really go downhill. And I was traveling at the time. I had a plan to go I was gonna go see my kids. They were visiting Utah, and then I was gonna go, um, hang out with my cousin Christy and her parents in Arizona, and then if I didn't have an answer as far as why things were happening the way that they had, or more importantly, what I was supposed to do with this experience, um, I had a plan to go back and, do what I was going to do in Maryland. And, in the midst of all this, um, I found myself kneeling in prayer one night and I said, I can't even try to pretend like I'm grateful tonight. I'm not grateful for anything right now. And I want so badly just to go home. And, um, I knew I wasn't going to do anything that night, but I'm like, I would just assume not wake up tomorrow. And if that's not going to happen, if you're going to give me another day, please give me a purpose to go with that. Give me some insight as to what I'm supposed to do. Give me something to do that is going to put all of this in perspective. And that answer didn't come the next day or the day after. It actually happened when I was in Arizona on the last stop of my trip. And I was sitting there with my cousin Christy, talking about some of the things she had been through with her daughter being born with an unexpected limb difference and not having the help she needed, and with her own battle with chronic pain. And I said, Christy, these stories have something strong in common. There's real threads we can pull on here to try to create a holistic solution. And I'm not doing this by myself. But if you're in, we can make a nonprofit and actually try to work on these things. And fortunately, she's like, yeah, let's do it. And from that moment, um, it's like the cloud lifted just enough to get me excited about something again, to be completely, safe by the time I got on that plane from Phoenix back to Baltimore, and, um, to focus on, okay, I still can't make heads or tails out of any of us, but I know that we're here to do this work. And so even when I had to have surgery a few weeks later, even when I lost the use of multiple fingers that fall, even when, COVID hit and just life kept happening, I've had kind of that anchor to rely on and say, okay, I know what I'm here to do now.
Yeah, and it's so cool. I feel like it's always in our kind of darkest moments where we find that passion or that piece of life that we're missing. And yours like came during when you're having this chronic pain and this mental health crisis. What do you feel uh you know go through these hard times, but what do you feel like gave you the strength to carry on building this nonprofit?
I think um, because it came in the moment that it did, and because it wasn't the first time either. I mentioned earlier that the mentors who said, "Hey, go to law school," that came in the midst of an anxiety attack. In 2017 when that happened, I was 6 weeks out from, or 7 weeks out from, hip and femur surgery, and I had pushed myself hard enough to the point where I had actually torn a tendon in my opposing foot. And then I had gone through a 5-day stretch where I was so anxious I could barely eat anything. I ate like 2 meals over that 5 days. And that's the moment where the mentors come and say, "You should go to law school." And my response is, "I'm getting my butt kicked right now already." But, um that's that tends to be when the revelation finds me, is when I am, um I guess when I'm desperate enough and beaten down enough that I'm ready to listen.
Y Yeah, I think that goes for me too. It's like, how far down in this rut do I have to be before something hits me in the head and feels like, "No, this is the route you're taking. Like, you're going to do this. You're gonna push through this, and this is what I want you to do." So you're not
Absolutely.
alone in that aspect. It's just, I guess, like the reality is, just a lot of times it just sucks that you have to get to that point in order for something like that to click.
Yeah, and I
And
have
you off, um,
I was gonna say I have one of those brains too where I have the kind of ADHD where either my mind is gonna be working on something productive or it's gonna be tearing itself apart. There really is no in between.
mhm. Yeah, and I'm the same way. My mind is often telling me, things tearing me apart, and it's just something I've learned to live with. One of the things that I love is that you've kind of mentioned, like, turning pain into purpose. How do you do that without minimizing the pain itself?
You know, um, I guess it really came to a point where I asked myself, how how does my relationship with this pain best serve me and then by extension best serve others? And um I have never, at least not for quite some time, been the kind of person who reads the scriptures in such a way that I would come out and say everything happens for a reason. But um I do read the scriptures in such a way that because okay, you know, there is the ability to turn really awful things into something good. And we may or may not have that ability, but God certainly does. And so a lot of times it's relying on him and saying, okay, what can I do with this? Or what are you going to do with this? Or whatever the case may be. And sometimes it's saying, okay, there are people that I need to forgive and turning that into training for professionals as part of that forgiveness process. Sometimes it's giving myself grace and saying, you know, I can only do what I can do, and my best that day is good enough. And sometimes it's reminding myself that it's okay to acknowledge that having a shoulder that's out of place and you can't get it back in, or um, not being able to sit up because your hip has just been recently operated on, or whatever, having to crawl up 3 flights of stairs after having Achilles surgery. You know, it's okay to acknowledge those things suck because they do, but just trying not to stay there because that was my hardest thing um growing up and for a lot of my early adulthood was not allowing myself to acknowledge the difficulties in life and then learning to say, look, you can't just not acknowledge it. You have to acknowledge it. It will tear you apart if you don't. But you don't have to stay there. You don't have to linger in that moment. You can say, okay, this is really hard and I don't understand all of the things that go into this, but I know enough to keep trying and I know enough to do what I can with this to try to turn it into something good.
I absolutely love that, especially the piece where you said to acknowledge it, because it's like I feel like that's the problem that a lot of people have is we go through all these difficult things in life, but we don't acknowledge that we're actually going through them. We just try to push through in hopes that everything will be better. But sometimes I feel like without acknowledging it, I don't know if there is a way to always get through it. I hope that makes sense. Like, it's like I feel like just acknowledging the issues you're going through is an important piece to carry on.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I think we often forget the fact that when we acknowledge these things, oftentimes they lose the upper hand. They lose a good chunk of their power. once we acknowledge and say, okay, I see you, I feel you, I know you're there, but um, you're not the complete picture. So, move on. And sometimes that's easier said than done. You know, I I think it's important to say, even though I had this story that ended in a lot of ways back in 2019, 2020, that doesn't mean, oh, start a nonprofit and mental health struggles go away. Not even a little. Um, but I do have more tools in my tool chest now than I had back then for sure.
Yeah, that's an important piece. I remember these remind me of a kind of a therapy story. Um, I remember when I started going to like heavy duty therapy to overcome some mental health issues, but I shouldn't use the word overcome because they're still there. But my therapist looked me in the eyes and he's like, Travis, you're acting like you're treating your anxiety and depression like they're just going to be swiped away. That's not why we're here. And I was like, what do you mean they're not going to be let go away? He's like, I'm here to teach you the tools so you have the right techniques to deal with them every day because you're pretty much stuck with them. And once I
Absolutely.
kind of grasped that perception, like it kind of clicked in my head. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. So I stuck with them. So I just have to learn the techniques to keep pushing through.
Yeah, and in my mind, it helps when you've got that good connection with the therapist as well. Because you can't, some feedback has been less than helpful and some feedback has been life changing. And so I think it's important to figure out, what tools work for you and keep trying until you find something that is resonating.
Yes, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And I want to kind of jump to your nonprofit here. We brought it up. Pieces of me. As I was reading, prepping for this conversation, I noticed that one of your main focuses was it reducing the stigma. Why? I'm just curious why stigma reduction is the area you felt to focus on because stigma reduction is a really hard thing to like speak about and stuff. Like it's just because everybody's perspective I feel is a little bit different than everybody else's. Like it seems like a
Well,
really cool but challenging thing.
and I'm, um, it I'm definitely up for a challenge, so I think you're right though. And the reason we went with that route is because on one hand you have raising awareness, which is right. And on the other hand, you
Mhm.
have action oriented things. Let's go put in some braille, let's go build a ramp, whatever. And the problem is awareness that doesn't lead to action doesn't really do anything. And simple projects, I'm going to build a ramp, I'm going to put in braille, I'm going to, you know, um, do whatever one sort of thing. It's not replicable. It's not, at least not on an ever growing basis. If we focused on, oh, we're going to use pieces of me money to go put in a ramp, that automatically limits how many structural adaptations we can fund. The reason we sit in the middle with stigma reduction is we believe that good information is the antidote to stigma. So we have an awareness piece that is built on being transformative rather than simply being informational and really edifying, really being a catalyst for change. And so, by virtue of that, and by virtue of addressing the fundamental misconceptions about disability, the idea that accessibility is too expensive, the idea that inclusion equals lowering standards, all of those things that are tied to stigma, that's in our mind how you build a coalition where it's not just me and my small team, it's a group of more and more people coming together and saying, we will offer what we have toward this end. We will meet people where they are. We will call them in, and we will actually show them how to become part of the solution in a way that makes sense to them. So, um, if we find a business leader and we say, instead of just convincing you to let us build a ramp, why don't we teach you why this is important and how it relates to your business? And if we do that right, they're going to go build their own ramp and do their own door opener and do their own braille and do their own website and then tell everybody else why they did it. It then becomes sustainable, it becomes scalable, and that's how you achieve real social change. At least that is the theory of the case for us.
And that completely makes sense. And because it's like you're not just going and saying, okay, well, you need to be build a ramp for this and this reason. You're actually giving them the education needed to help those people understand like why it's needed. So you're yeah, I get where you're coming from now. I love it.
Yeah, and we don't. Um, I think it's important to say too. We don't speak in terms of social mandates. Do I
Hmm.
believe that people with disabilities deserve to have a chance? Yes. Do I believe that access is a
Hmm.
human right? Yes. But if we go into these conversations with anything that sounds like us versus them, we've already lost the battle. I am a huge Stephen Covey fan, and I believe that what made his career what it was his ability to bring in people who thought they had diverging interests and find ways to show them a win-win proposition that made 1 and 1 equal 5. And to me, that's what I want to do with accessibility. I love reaching out to business owners or faith leaders or whomever and saying, my job is to make what you're doing even more powerful and impactful than it already is. And here is the ingredient I have to offer toward that end. And if what I suggest is not replicable, sustainable, and relevant to you, in other words, if it's not a win win, we're not going to go forward until we find an option that is.
Yeah, completely makes sense. It leads me kind of into my next question here. How can organizations, schools, workplaces create environments where people with disabilities genuinely feel seen and empowered?
The first thing is building a people centric culture. And what that means is get curious, have a growth mindset, build iteration into your processes, and really look at your processes, policies, procedures from the lens of how do we bake in strengthening every person that's on the team or everyone that we interact with. Because if you've got a fixed mindset as an organization, sure, I can come in and teach you a couple of things, or any other expert can come in and teach you a couple of things, but it's not going to stick. It's not going to create buy in. But if I walk into an organization who is hungry for new knowledge, who is always looking at taking that next step or looking for that next edge, I can offer up some best practices and it's going to integrate into what they're doing pretty much seamlessly.
This is all good stuff. I love it. I know I'm a broken record and I say I love everything, but it's true. Like I love hearing new ideas and different perspectives on things. Like it's because things I never really think about. Uh, what would you say? What conversations around? I'm going to kind of group these two together. I know we could separate them probably, but what conversations around disability and mental health are we still too uncomfortable to have openly as a society?
I think the first thing is in both cases, we're um we're uncomfortable having really any conversation around them. And um that's gotta change. Before we got on air, we were talking, you and I, about, me doing a training for some teenagers and me actively encouraging them to ask bold, audacious, borderline offensive questions. And the reason was because I I wanted them to not fear the topic. And I think, with mental health specifically, there's there's such a fear of sharing something that is so vulnerable and so deep. It's heavy. You know, some of the things we covered in the first chunk of this podcast were really heavy, dark things, and we can't skirt around that. But we need to find a way to be able to say, okay, in the right setting, in the right moment, we have to have these conversations because, hope dies in isolation.
Very, very well said. And I agree. Like I just feel I've ever since I felt that like started this podcast, I feel like the conversations, like every conversation is important. Whether it's, somebody who wrote a book to somebody who really just wants to share their story and get it out there. And it's honestly very hard to be vulnerable because you don't want to. I feel like especially the mental health side of things, for me, it's it's almost like you almost feel a certain sense of shame when you start sharing your story, but at the same time, it's like liberating as well.
It is. And I guess one more thing I would add on to your question that I think is really important is that, pieces doesn't rank disabilities. We don't participate in the ordering of such. And we treat bipolar or depression or anxiety or lupus or blindness. We treat it all the same as being something that impacts people's lives, sometimes really severely. Um, we have always had the notion that we want to make sure that people understand, this is a place for you, even if you're like, well, being depressed must not be as bad as being blind. Well, that's not really a helpful conversation to have. It's those comparison things are invalidating and marginalizing. And instead we need to say, look, if you're struggling, how do we fix that? How do we, lighten that load somehow? And oftentimes, what you need if you're going through a mental health crisis, or even if you're just trying to sustain your mental health, it's similar to what you need with any other quote unquote disability. Maybe some of the practical aspects are different, but the underlying philosophy, the underlying infrastructure is very similar.
Yeah, yes, it is. And I like what was it that sorry, I totally just lost my train of thought. It'll come back. Uh today, like staying grounded and keeping the hope within yourself alive as you're, pursuing this nonprofit. And moving that forward, what does staying grounded look like to you?
It means um it means a lot of self-care for one thing. You know, I have a lot of conversations that are really difficult. I go into rooms either physically or virtually and have interactions that could very easily be and often are triggering. So it's a matter of keeping things in perspective. And similarly, it's also about saying, okay, my best today is good enough. If I'm dealing with a lot of pain or if I'm, struggling, um, if I'm struggling to do my best work, to not let that bad day define me and to say, okay, I offered what I could, you know, hopefully there's tomorrow. I guess what also helped was learning that I didn't have to be at 10 out of 10 that day to make an impact. Some days I'm feeling like I'm at a 4 out of 10 and get off that call or get off that podcast recording and somebody's like, wow, that was really awesome. And I'm like, really? I thought I sucked. Um, and, and just understanding that it's a growth journey and it's it's about leaving the best legacy we can, the best impact we can with the tools we have, and trusting that as we do that, the impact is going to happen, the tools are going to grow. You know, those things have a way of multiplying as we're faithful in offering up whatever we can in service.
Mhm. Fantastic. I remember what I was going to say now as you were talking. I liked what you said about comparing ourselves to others. I actually remember interviewing somebody, and as they were saying something, I made some comment, and it was me comparing my story to theirs. And they're like, no, no, wait, you can't do that. You can't compare your story. Like just because like at the moment my story sounds harder than what you went through, that's not necessarily true because it's all different. And so since then, I have learned to not compare my story to others because we're all dealing with some kind of crap along the same lines.
Yeah, and I think content matters there too. So I'm gonna give you a quick story. The best
Yeah, go ahead.
therapist I've ever had um, was very open with his own mental health struggles, and more than that, so I walked into his office in Washington for our first meeting. I'm dealing with um, severe chronic pain, and I'm like, I'm tired of being dismissed by a therapist and tired of being called grandiose, blah blah blah. I walk in there kind of with a chip on my shoulder, and I'm like, okay, do you even understand what pain really means? And he's like, he chuckles and he says, let me tell you a story about when I was playing hockey and I got hit in the nether regions hard enough that it shattered my cup. And I said, okay, we're on the same page. Uh, and that wasn't, um, it wasn't a comparison. It wasn't meant to be my pain is greater than yours, but it was a means of establishing connection. So
Mhm.
I think if it's, "Hey, I don't understand what you've been through, but here's what I've been through, and I think there's some similarities. Can we build on that common ground?" We need more of that.
Yes, we do for sure. And it's a good way to put it though, is finding that common ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think sorry, go ahead.
Nope, you're good. You're good.
I'm just gonna say,
If you have another thought, go for it.
I'm just gonna say, if we're when we're trying to establish rapport and you establish that connection, if we don't offer that we do have experience that is tangential, perhaps not comparable, but tangential. We lose credibility that we otherwise might have obtained. You know, for me, it really mattered that my therapist had some level of understanding of my values, my struggles, my questions. It really helped his words resonate. It really helped his message resonate. Um, when I found myself in crisis in 2019, and he was contemplating whether or not he needed to, pull the emergency switch and have me committed that night, because we had the rapport we did, I trusted his judgment. So I do agree the comparison, if it's an us versus them, if it's a my pain is better than yours, that's bad. But I really hesitate to put forth anything that would bring people into having discussions about shared struggles.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Uh, just one last question here, and then a couple follow-ups. And I want to apologize if you hear my kids screaming in the background. They're
It's all
kind
right.
of really, really, really loud right now.
It's all right.
So looking back at the younger version of yourself who was underestimated and overlooked, what would you say to him now?
You know, because I had those moments and then I had the moments where something inside of me told me I was meant for more, I would tell myself, don't listen to the doubters, but don't fall into the trap of perfectionism. Your best on any given day is good enough, and just do what you can to make tomorrow better than today. And the rest will take care of itself.
Fantastic. Make tomorrow better than today. I, I really like that.
And by the way, if
And
tomorrow isn't better than today, then that's okay too. Just keep moving on an upward and forward trajectory overall.
yeah, in the end, that's really all we can do. What is it, like 1% better? I think there's something about 1% better. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but if you can be 1% better each day. Um, so what would you, this is a very generalized question, but I love to hear the answers that I get. What would you say is the biggest stigma when it comes to mental health?
I think the biggest one I see is that um, there's still a thought out there that you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps um and just kind of fight through it, and that's not just not how it is. And similarly, there's this, again, discordance between physical pain and mental pain, and anything that causes people to doubt whether they're heard is a bad thing. Anything that makes people feel marginalized, I'm not here for. So, um, yeah, I think that the biggest thing there is we need to honor the fact that even though we can't see it, we can't feel it, we can't touch it, but we believe somebody when they say they're struggling. And sometimes struggle looks differently for different people. Here we are, a couple of guys um who are, approaching middle age, and we're in a demographic that is at real risk overall. Men in our age range are much more likely to experience self-harm or die by suicide than the public thinks. And part of that is because our crisis looks differently than what people think. So I guess really at the end of the day, it's about assuming, it's about saying, okay, even if you look fine on the outside, what's really going on?
Yes, very well said. It is. I feel like there's so many people out there that you look at on a daily basis, and things just seem completely normal. It's what's going on the inside. It's you never ever know. Uh, so where can people find you in your work?
So we are Pieces of Me, and that's PEACES of me.org. You can find me on LinkedIn, Daniel Hodges, JD, MHA. Different cowboy hat, but you'll see me. Um, um, I'm on Substack, Daniel Hodges, JD, MHA as well. And I'll tell people you can remember how we spell pieces by remembering two things. First, we spelled it that way because we wanted people to understand that they're not broken. And real peace, at least in some part, comes by embracing who we are and the value we bring to the world, regardless of our characteristics and circumstances. And the second reason we spell pieces the way we do is because we don't believe you have to burn something down in order to get your point across. You know, we are firm in our conviction that access is a human right, and we are equally firm in our conviction that the way that we're going to get to where accessibility and inclusion are ubiquitous is by working together and being peacemakers who create the best coalition possible to solve this together. So pieces, PEACES of me.org.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. And the last thing here is I feel like we covered a lot of ground here in our conversation. Is there anything you would like to add that we did not discuss?
You know, for those of you who are um out there with any sort of disability, whether it be mental health or otherwise, again, I'm going to go back and saying your best is good enough. Your your gifts, your talents, your contributions still matter, and there is real power in serving in whatever way makes sense to you. And if you're an ally or a family member, whatever, wanting to know, can I make an impact? Can I make a difference? It seems so vast. Offer what you can. That's really all there is to it. Just offer what you can, and you'll be amazed the power that you hold by simply just giving whatever you can.
Agreed. And sometimes that's all we can do is just give whatever we can. It goes back to not knowing what people are going through. And Daniel, I want to thank you for coming onto the show and making it work and being flexible. I admire what you're doing and helping educate people on accessibility. And thank you to those listening to Overcome with Travis White. If this resonated with you, please give us a follow and leave us a 5-star review. Thanks again. Until next time.